Now welcome to the stage George Mitchell, Bertie Ahern, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton.
In behalf of the people assembled here and all the people of Northern Ireland, it's a great honor for me to welcome the former Prime Ministers of the UK and Ireland and the former President of the United States. They didn't hear the prior panel, so they didn't hear Jonathan Powell pledge to be ruthless in cutting off speakers if they ran over time. I'm unaccustomed to telling American presidents that they're not able to continue speaking, and also prime ministers. So I'm going to rely upon their good judgment in ending this within the approximately 50 minutes that we have scheduled. That's a test for you, not for us. I want to get right to it. And so I'm going to ask a general question first and ask each of the three to respond. Prime Minister Blair, I'll start with you. You were, along with the Taoiseach and the President, were very deeply involved in the negotiations that led to the agreement. You and the Taoiseach were here for the last week. We all recall some of it fondly, and I'd like to ask for your thoughts and recollections on the significance of those events, what has transpired since then up to the present time, and what you would most like to remember, and perhaps also where you felt we didn't quite make the grade. So in whatever form you like to, please proceed.
Well, Senator Mitchell, George, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and honour to be here, and particularly to be here with these three people. George, without your work in the run-up to that negotiation 20 years ago, we frankly would never have had anything to negotiate about. So thank you for that. To Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, I recall during the whole of that negotiation his total dedication. Even when he had a personal bereavement, he came and he gave his time and his effort and his intelligence and his energy to finding peace. And also to President Clinton, who we're delighted to see here, because he was the call a friend during the course of the negotiation. I mean, when anything got really, really difficult, we'd pick up the phone and ask him to help. And I do remember at one point, because as the days went on, you became slightly disoriented with the negotiation, saying to my folk, "They are 5 hours ahead over there, aren't they?" They said, "No, they're 5 hours behind." So that was 3 o'clock in the morning, but he was up and alive and willing to give us the benefit of his advice. So I would like to give some brief opening remarks in this way. For me, this began personally in my own childhood when I was growing up, when we used to spend every summer in Donegal, and when I remember as the Troubles began in the late 60s, my family that used to have close relationships, although they were from a Protestant background with their Catholic neighbors, how as those Troubles began, those relationships soured, and then we entered into this period of hatred and bitterness and division and terrorism and sectarianism, which then lasted for many, many years. And so those of us who used to remember what things were like before the Troubles and then remember the Troubles, remember what a terrible period it was. And I remember when we came to power in May 1997, at that point, the ceasefire that John Major had put together with a lot of wisdom and energy had broken down. And I actually remember the very first speech that I made as Prime Minister was here in Northern Ireland, really to the Unionist community. And so we began what was almost a year lead-in to that Good Friday negotiation. But even when we got to the negotiation, it was very touch and go as to whether anything was going to happen at all. I remember you and I discussing that at the time, George, and thinking it looked pretty hopeless. But then over the days that followed, we managed to put this together. And we put it together not because of the work that we did, but because there were political leaders in Northern Ireland who were prepared to make real sacrifices and show real courage in the search for peace. But the important thing is this: when we reached that agreement and then announced it, that was the beginning. And I think this is really important in the context of today. We didn't conclude the Good Friday Agreement and then everything was gentle and easy and comfortable. On the contrary, then over the next 9 years, I remember sometimes every month, sometimes every week, sometimes every day, we were working at it again. And we were going back and having meetings, sometimes short meetings, sometimes long meetings. And we were dealing with the new police service in Northern Ireland. We were dealing with decommissioning. We were dealing with criminal justice matters, with cultural matters. And my point is, when we then came to that moment in May 2007, when the executive came up and running and the extraordinary sight of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley sitting down together, that was the culmination of a long and arduous road in which we were working all the time to try and make it happen. And my point very simply today is this, because, you know, as I've done interviews over these last few days, many people have said to me, well, you know, the executive's no longer up and running. Has it really worked? We even have some politicians saying, does it really matter? The important thing is not to compare where we are with where ideally we would want to be, because ideally we would want to be in a better place than where we are. The comparison is with where we are and where we were. And the important thing is to remember that. Remember when we used to wake up every single day to the news of death, destruction, terrorism. And I know that the tensions are still there, the divisions are still there, the difficulties are still there. But I would say, whatever the difficulties and whatever the challenges, whatever the problems, this agreement is worth preserving and building upon. Don't cast it aside, because where we are may not be where we want to be, but it's a world better than where we were. So this, I think, is the most important thing I would say right now, is to those people who are today in positions of responsibility and have to work out how to work their way through the present impasse, give it your all, don't stop working at it, don't ever give up on it, and realize that what you're doing is vital, it's important, it's about the future of the people of Northern Ireland, and this Good Friday Agreement, for all its faults, is something that was worth doing, and it's worth keeping.
On the Sunday before the agreement was reached, 5 days earlier, the Taoiseach's mother died. And I will never forget he coming here to have breakfast with Prime Minister Blair and I at 7 o'clock one morning, then returning to Dublin for his mother's funeral, then coming back to re-engage in the meetings later in the day. And so for several days he was dealing with personal loss. and yet contributing enormously to the decisions necessary to move forward. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern.
Thank you very much, Senator Mitchell and George. It's a great honour to be here, and I know this is a very special place in Queen's University to you. You've given many, many years to Queen's as Chancellor and helping in so many ways to build this fine university up to in excess of 25,000 students now. And I want to thank Queen's as well for all of the efforts that they've made into making today and these days possible. It's always wonderful to be with two people that I admire so much, have become great friends. I don't think we ever had rows or arguments. We had plenty of debates, and I want to thank them both for the friendship, the commitment and the effort that they've given to the Irish peace process during 20 years plus. It has been wonderful to work with them. And thank you, Tony, for all those days that we spent together. You could have got a better building than Castle Buildings, but anyway. I did admire Lancaster House, number 10, Leeds Castle, Weston Park. The food was far better and the drink wasn't bad either, but anyway. And Bill, you've been such a friend to me, to my family, and to all of us. It's just an honour to be with you always. I think, like all of us, you pick up somewhere along the way where you'd like to try and make a difference. And I think not only in public life or elected life, but when you're growing up, and I grew up, it's 50 years this coming October, 5th of October, when the civil rights movement started, and really which is credited with starting all of the marches and then led on later on into the Troubles. So I was finishing what would be second level college in that last year. And every year after that, we don't need to go through the recital, but it was always the sad, hard, depressing, but factual news of what was happening in Northern Ireland, what was happening in this great city, and also happening in the Republic to a lesser extent. And when we came around, having grown into that and been in political life, and many, many times seeming and watching older politicians than I in government and in Leinster House, thinking that this was almost impossible to find any resolution. And I acknowledge the huge efforts that all of those before us made in 74 and in 85 in particular, in those two big efforts. But when we came around, and I remember well, we were talking about 15,000 plus bombs later, 28,000 shootings later, 47,000 events that were of a violent nature, the 3,700 people that were killed, and all of that, and 30 people a month for 30 years dying, and all that happened. It was incredible. And I think all as we wanted to do was to give impetus and direction to a process, working with the people here to try and find an honourable accommodation that would cross the relationships without people sacrificing what was special to them. And I think for all the years that I had the honour of working with Prime Minister Tony Blair and working with all the party leaders, I always used to reflect, and I think both of us reflected, and with the enormous support whenever we needed it, not just on the Holy Week of 1998, but in all the years after that, when Bill Clinton was in office and when he was out of offices, from his huge amount of visits that he paid to this island, was to see if there was a way that we could help people to hold their aspirations, but at the same time get honourable compromises that would make a difference and where people could work together and live together and not have violence in their society. And that was the ethos and the principle of the Good Friday Agreement. It was not to sort every issue from A to a Z, from 1 to a million. That is not what we were trying to do. We weren't crazy people. But we thought if we could pull people together, or help to pull people together, or try to get the relationship to understand that there's different objectives and different views and different sides, and that we could do it together. And we had to at times. Tony would take one side, I would take the other. Sometimes we wouldn't be necessarily agreeing, but we worked to try to do that. And what I remember more than anything else, George, was the great people we worked with across all parties, people who were nervous of the position, nervous of what they were trying to do, worried at the same time if we didn't do it, what would happen on the other side of it. And you gave us enough of warnings in that, that if we left this after the agreement, where we would be if we didn't succeed. And I think every day I think of it now, that's the next piece. Like, decommissioning was huge, prisoners was huge, reform of policing was massive, the whole parity of esteem in the criminal justice system, these issues. We spent years at these things with good advisors, good officials, which we remember and thank, and particularly remember those people who are no longer with us, both politicians and officials. But what's important in life, I think, and there's nothing more important than trying to stop people being killed, to let people live their life in the normal way, to educate your kids, see your kids grow, see your grandkids grow, see them work, see peace, see the city develop the way it is now. I walked the other night where I hadn't walked for 20 years. I walked with John de Chastelain down around the Titanic Quarter to see the new hotel and the developments, the most iconic and best visited place in the whole world, the Titanic Centre. And then you feel that you're getting somewhere. And all, as I say respectfully to the politicians, you know, big issues were resolved not by the four of us, but by everybody. There are issues remaining. I don't think that they're bigger than the issues we resolved. I'm not saying they're easy or trivialize them. And I do hope that sooner rather than later, not for us, not for legacy issues, not for anything other than the people who live on the island of Ireland, and particularly Northern Ireland, that you must see this through to the next phase. And I wish you well in doing that.
At 10 o'clock in Belfast on that Thursday evening, while we were at Stormont, ricocheting from one meeting to another, an aide came to me and said, the president's on the phone for you. And as I walked from where I was back into my office, I made the immediate calculation. It's the president calling. That began a series of calls that lasted throughout the night. Finally, at one point, it was the next morning here, and I was online. I said, it must be 3 o'clock in the morning. What are you doing? He said, oh, I can't sleep. I've got to stay involved. He was telephoning me and the prime ministers and many of the delegates who were at the talks. It was an indication of the president's deep concern about this. And I also recall, you may have forgotten this, 2 years earlier, he was facing re-election, and he called and asked me to return to the United States to assist in the preparation for his first debate with his opponent, who was the Senate minority leader, and I'd been the majority leader. And he said to me, well, you know him better than anybody. You can help in the debate preparation. So I flew from Belfast. We were at a small resort town in upstate New York, and as soon as I arrived, I went in to have dinner with the president, and staff had given me books of briefings, so I was prepared to talk about the debates. We sat down at that first dinner, and he spent the entire evening asking me questions about what was happening in Northern Ireland. On the eve of probably the most important debate in his life up until that time, We talked about Northern Ireland for about an hour and a half, a good indication of where it stood in his sense of priorities. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome my president and dear friend, Bill Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Senator Mitchell was too modest to tell you the rest of the story. After I grilled him about the situation in Northern Ireland, we had a mock debate. He played Bob Dole, and he beat my brains out. I mean, it wasn't close. It was a humiliating experience, and I thought, thank God I'm not running against George Mitchell. I did pretty good in the debate because he roughed me up so bad. I'd like to make a couple of introductory comments. First of all, when the United States tries to help someone else in a peace process, the narrower the agenda, the easier it is. For example, there was this huge, almost violence-causing boundary dispute between Peru and Ecuador that ended in the Amazon rainforest. I thought, this is nutty. These people have got a great future. So we sent somebody down there. We solved it. And my only role was to send 10 members of the U.S. military to patrol the border at the end point of the dispute in the middle of the rainforest. When I started, those 10 people all wanted to go AWOL. They thought, Bill Clinton's lost his mind. He sent me out here nowhere. By the time the whole thing was over, they never wanted to leave. Then the more people's lives are infected and the more complicated issues are, the deeper it can get. In the end, there are only two things the United States can do to help other people. Now we may need you to come help us, but in the end, we can do our very best to maximize the rewards and minimize the risks of those who are brave enough to seek peace. And then, if we're trusted, we can do our very best to listen with a friendly and caring ear to all the interests and do our best to close the gaps. That's what George did. And he was a genius at it. And I'm very grateful to him. It all started when he was leaving the Senate. I practically jumped off the bridge in Washington, D.C. when he told me he was going to leave the Senate. So I decided to punish him by giving him a part-time job as a special economic envoy to Northern Ireland, which then morphed into being the peace negotiator. And when he woke me up for the 57th time on April the 9th, I was grouching, and he said, "You gave me this part-time job. Now you have to help me succeed." So I thank him. Bertie and Tony and I became close friends. Our families became friends. They were inexhaustible. I'm grateful to them. But I'd also like to say that I'm very grateful to their predecessors, to John Bruton and Albert Reynolds, and to John Major, who made this first declaration before I got involved at all in December of '92, and could well have been deposed because of it. He had a very narrow majority. And thank you, David Trimble, for not taking him down. I'm grateful to all of them, but especially to these guys. We tried to clean it up. The main things that I tried to do was to jumpstart the thing and to give it early confidence. I had become interested in Northern Ireland when I was a student at Oxford. The troubles began when I was a 22-year-old graduate student at Oxford. And all I knew was that my mother's family was Scots-Irish. They were from Fermanagh. They lived in a little house. For the oldest known farmhouse in our family is mid-1700s, just outside Rosalie. And I'm sure that my Scots-Irish Protestant forebears must have intermarried with Catholics just across the border, because I seem so genetically predisposed to try to get you together. But anyway, I cared about it. And then when I was running for president, there was a big block of people in New York who wanted the United States to get involved and appoint a special envoy. And as I prepared for this meeting, I just kept thinking, you know, the Irish diaspora is so big. And there were 44 million people of Irish descent. A huge Irish Catholic community, but an even larger Scots-Irish Protestant community. 25% of all the uniformed soldiers in the history of the United States have been Scots-Irish. And so I thought, you know, if we got organized, we ought to be able to help if there was a willingness to do it. So we started working on it. The first issue that came up is whether I should give Mr. Adams a visa. When Sinn Féin had indicated they were interested in an end to violence, the State Department looked at me like I had lost my mind. The British press went crazy and said Bill Clinton's just trying to get even with John Major because he searched the passport files of the British government, because we all know Clinton tried to give away his passport so he could go to Russia and become a Soviet citizen to oppose the Vietnam War. Fake news did not begin day before yesterday. So anyway, so the whole thing was silly. Our ambassador to the UK at the time was a very distinguished man who risked his reputation to endorse me in 1992 when I was being attacked for my lack of military service, Admiral William Crowe, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, "You can't do this. I won't be able to do my job." I said, "Bill, if I don't do it, your job may not be very fulfilling." So I took a flying leap, and thank you, Jerry Adams, for not betraying my trust and for honoring the commitments you made. And then the thing started. It was hard for David Trimble, but he hung in there. He got a Nobel Prize, but his party lost their leadership within the center-right, as often happens. I'm proud of Seamus Mallon and what he did is in government when you guys stood up Stormont. I talked to John Hume's wife, Pat, today, and I thought, you know, they were the sort of spiritual home for people across the spectrum who believed there had to be an end to violence. But they knew their political position would weaken if an agreement was made, because once an agreement is made, you want the toughest people you can to work out the details. So we wound up with the famous odd couple of McGuinness and Paisley. Now that I could not have mediated. It made it work. And Peter then came along, and I thank you. I thank all of you who served. I see Mark Durkin out there and all these people. They deserve all the credit. They and the citizens groups, the women's groups, all the thousands of Irish kids who wrote me letters and You know, that was before email. We still had lots of snail mail then. So thank God I've got records of all these letters. But here's what I want to say about it. In the wake of all this tribalism going on all over the world today, all this identity politics, all this, it's almost deeply psychological belief that there has been so much economic change and social dislocation and rearranging the deck chairs and society's hierarchies that people are pulling back. The Good Friday Agreement is a work of genius that's applicable if you care at all about preserving democracy. That's the first point I want to make. Because it called for real democracy, majority rule, minority rights, individual rights, the rule of law, the end of violence, shared political decision-making, shared economic benefits. Shared special relations, maintained the relationship with the United Kingdom, expanded the relationship with the Irish Republic, and then let the future take its course. The most interesting thing was, by creating a space for the identity and the interests and the values of all the people involved in a framework which protected democracy and let future demographic, economic, and political changes take Northern Ireland wherever it would go. It was a work of surpassing genius. And in a world today where there are people who are aggressively trying to destroy the very idea of popular democracy, it embodied everything that I believe works best. I could fill this great hall with the studies that have been done showing that diverse groups make better decisions than homogeneous ones. That compromise actually leads you on a path of progress that is more sustainable than dictation does. So what I want to say to you is, and I know George is going to do some follow-up, but do not underestimate the value of the fact that this was done by people of different parties, different persuasions, and not one damn time, as nearly as I can tell, in the whole process did anyone ever suggest that democracy itself should be abandoned, that the results of elections should not be respected, that some people's votes should be denied, discredited, or that facts were not facts. There is now a whole global industry of academic research on how democracies decline. We no longer take them for granted. How did we blow it when Russia had a chance? When China seemed to be opening to the world, is this a closure when the leader of China now says, I want to serve for life? What does it mean that Hungary, a country that almost certainly would not be free, had it not been for decades and decades and decades of support from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from NATO, has a leader who says he thinks Russia's a better model for them than parliamentary democracy? What all these people show is that you need three things to keep a democracy alive. A reasonable amount of prosperity and growth, reasonably distributed. In other words, keep the cranes up in Belfast at all costs. You need an amount of social solidarity, which is not the same thing as homogeneity. There are many very diverse societies that have enormous social solidarity, but they all have systems like the Good Friday Accord. Everybody gets heard. Everybody gets a chance. Everybody's got a role to play. And the third thing is an information ecostructure where people accept the same facts. So at least they're arguing off of a rational basis. In other words, I'll take education. You can argue about what's the best way to teach arithmetic. But first you have to agree that 2 plus 2 equals 4. There are all these forces today designed to convince people that that may not even be true. So you have to have all this. You've got that. You have 20 years of this deal. And you have the preservation of democracy under extreme duress. You have the next chairs changing. And still you got it. Don't underestimate that. Or the gratitude you owe to all these people who are here and those who have passed away. The odd couple, Martin and Paisley, or those incapacitated and not here, John Hume. Celebrate that this day. And then you'll ask what George is about to ask us. Now what? But you cannot imagine, you could not have known when you were doing this, that by the time we got to the 20th anniversary, it would look like a prized jewel just because you had done it in a totally empowering, democratic way. So it's a pain in the rear to you because you have the option of paralysis now. Because we require consent, we require compromise, we require this. Be proud of it. Keep the cranes up. Keep the voices free. Keep the votes fair. You'll figure it out. Thank you.
I want to ask one more question, but I've been reminded by 6 different people in the audience that there's 10 minutes left. So I'm going to exert my executive authority and say there's 15 minutes left. That's right. So I want to ask one other question and ask you each to give us about 5 minutes on that so we can wrap it up and not be too late to the next event. And I'll begin again with the Prime Minister. In all of the interviews today, and Bertie and I did some interviews in Dublin over the weekend, obviously there's a great deal of concern about 2 separate matters. The first is that the Assembly has not functioned for over a year. The second is the border, the implications of Brexit, where we are now, where can we go? Are the principles of the Good Friday Agreement dead? Have they expired? Are they relevant? So, Prime Minister, any thoughts you have to begin, and I'll ask you, the Taoiseach and the President, give us about 5 minutes each on, to the extent that you wish to do so, current events, the current application. What does the future look like? People are still apprehensive.
Sure. Thanks, George. Just before I answer those 2 points directly, I should say that I completely agree with Bertie about castle buildings. And I actually remember leaving castle buildings and going straight to the plane where I was due to go, and I had been due to go 3 days previously with my family to go and spend a weekend with the family of the Prime Minister of Spain at the time, in order to have a sort of high-level discussion. So I was like 3 days late. Anyway, I get on the plane, and just as we're about to take off, the pilot comes back with a little Nokia phone and says to me, "There's someone on the phone for you." And I say to him, "Look, man, I'm really white. I don't want to speak to anyone." He says, "Well, she says she's the Queen." So I said, "Well, in that case, I better take it." So I take it. Anyway, I then fall asleep. I get to Spain. I get to the Prime Minister's place, and I say to him, "Look, I'm really, really sorry. I'm like 3 days late, and I've left you with my family and my wife, my kids, my mother-in-law." And he says, "Yeah, no," he says, "I've been having a great conversation, actually, with your mother-in-law." I said, "Okay." He says, yeah, about Gibraltar." I go back to say, Grandma, what you've been saying. Anyway, as if we hadn't enough to deal with. But so look, first of all, let me deal with the Brexit, which I could obviously talk not for 5 minutes on, but 5 days. I'm passionately opposed to Brexit. I think it is a profound mistake for my country. But, and I hope it may still not happen, but that's another subject altogether. Brexit will pose a challenge, of course, because for the last 100 years, the Republic of Ireland and the UK has been in the same relationship with Europe all the time. Okay, for 50 years, we were outside of the European Union. Then in 1973, on the same day, and it wasn't a coincidence, it was the same day, on the same day, we joined. For the last 45 years, we've been in the European Union together. If Brexit goes ahead from the end of next March, we are going to be in a different relationship for the first time. And that is bound to pose a challenge. Now, let me make it clear. We are going to have to overcome that challenge. And we should overcome it, because preserving this agreement is really, really important. But those people who are either disdainful of the challenge or dismiss it, come on. This is going to require real focus and hard work, because we cannot return to a hard border between North and South. It would be a disaster for the agreement and for the relationship between the Republic and the UK, and therefore for the people of Northern Ireland. So, look, this is an issue, as I say, we're just going to have to work at it and overcome it. I wish it wasn't happening, but it is, and we should do our best to circumvent it. As for the impasse there is today, I just want to make one comment on it, because obviously I hope that this impasse can be resolved. But I tell you what the Northern Ireland, the process, taught me, and it was something about politics, because President Clinton, Bill was mentioning earlier, some of the people that were involved in this, David Trimble, Seamus Mallon, John Hume, of course, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, then in time, Ian Paisley. At each stage of this, there were people who were prepared to say difficult things to their own supporters. Now, I always think the biggest test in politics is not getting up and saying yes to your supporters. It's when you have to get up and say no. It's when you have to do compromises that don't get you the same round of applause as the stuff that's full on and your people want to hear. But it's those compromises and the courage in making them that achieves progress. And one of the things I learned about the whole process to do with Northern Ireland, because it was unlike anything I ever dealt with in government, is that people, every single person involved in this process, including you, Bertie, but all the politicians involved, all of them had personal stories. All of them had personal reasons, deep personal reasons, why they shouldn't compromise. All of them could have gone out to their supporters and said, you know what, people want us to compromise, but I'm not doing it because I'm standing up for you. But each one of them was prepared not to forget the past, but not to let it decide the future. Now, that was what was important about this process. And therefore, when I look at the Good Friday Agreement and I see the challenges there today, I've no doubt that if the political leaders want to overcome them, they will. But more than that, they should realize that this agreement, it was never going to solve all the problems of Northern Ireland. That's going to take a generation, maybe 2 generations to do. Look, you and I were both involved in Kosovo. Okay, about 20 years again, same anniversary. Today, there are still big problems between the Serbians, the Albanians, between the different elements within Kosovo. Even today, they're still working at it. But it's better than what they had. And even today, it's worth moving forward. And fortunately there, you've got a young leader in Albania, a young leader in Serbia, both of whom were intimately involved in that conflict, but who are prepared today to say, let's find a better way forward for the future. So the important thing about what we did, and it was a collective effort, is that just for once, politics came into alignment with principle and with practical common sense. And just for once, it achieved something. And it would never have happened unless, forget the people on this platform, but the people down there, many of whom are here today, unless they had been prepared to put all of the political self-interest aside and say what is right for the people, for their long-term future, what is going to make that future better than the past. And if we remember nothing else about that day, remember that was one time politics worked. And it worked because people, in fact, stopped behaving like politicians and behaved like human beings with a huge existential problem to solve, and were determined to solve it.
Taoiseach.
Well, George, on Brexit, we just have to try and work a way out of it. We could be here all night talking about it, but the reality is it is a challenge. It's no good saying it's not a challenge. It has to be negotiated. We cannot go back to any kind of a border. That would be madness for all of us. Everybody, the European Union, the British government, the Irish government, all the parties have said they don't want that. Of course, it's more difficult when you get into the small negotiations how you do that, but we're not going to try and do that today, and I just think we have to work our way out of it. I'd say one thing, but I said it earlier with Tony. We had a great relationship, the Irish government, the British government working, and others had before us and after us as well. But one of the great things about Europe and the European Union was that every week there was meetings. It would be attended by the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach, maybe once a month or once every 2 months. But there would be ministers, economic ministers, industrial ministers, education ministers, meeting. So there was a great bond of friendship grew up between the politicians from the Republic of Ireland and the UK through 45 years. And the officials as well, which was very important to it. That ends next March, because that basis of people meeting, that location of meeting, is finito come next March. There hasn't been enough of focus on that, because so many issues were sorted out on the ends of meetings. I would be in Tony's ear about something, and he'd be talking to me, and we'd be trying to work. I remember the foot and mouth crisis and many other crises where we were collectively working together. Not formal meetings, but just meetings on the side of European meetings. That all goes and has to be replaced by something. And those that say, and we won't mention any names, none of them are here, those who are saying that the Good Friday Agreement needs to be changed. Well, I think the Good Friday Agreement is the solution to that problem, and that the mechanisms of the Good Friday Agreement were going to have to replace those things that are lost because of the vote. And I think that's important that happens. And lastly, George, I really say to the leaders of today and tomorrow, it's never easy. And the art of politics is compromise. It's never any kind of a wrong thing to compromise. You can't make progress without compromise. There's always compromise everywhere in the world. People have to negotiate. But you need people to help each other. It's no good asking one side to compromise, because that's not compromise. Compromise is when people come together and say, listen, this is the dilemma, this is the difficulty, this is what is unsaleable to my people. Let us try and find a way out. I've spent a lifetime, whether it was in Europe, whether it was on trade unions or employers or farmers or anything, of trying to work out solutions and compromises. And I think always you have to remember, what makes it better for the ordinary Joe and Mary Soap on the street? What makes their life easier? What makes it easier for them to run their family and educate their kids and have a job and enjoy a social life and get an annual holiday if they can, and to go on? And that means the political system has to work. And let's be frank about it. Don't we all go into politics to have a say. Some people like to have a say in opposition. Well, I think that's not very wise. But I think it's always best to be able to do something about it, but I understand why some people never want that responsibility. But I think in the arrangement that we have in the Good Friday Agreement, it is that people collectively work together to make the decisions. The decisions about education, about health, about infrastructure, about welfare. And you know, I know that the 9 civil servants that are running Northern Ireland now are all brilliant people. I don't know if they're men or women or whatever, but they're all brilliant people, and I congratulate them on the effort. But we all know, because I meet people every week that tell me there are hundreds of decisions not being dealt with because of the stalemate. So isn't that a good reason to try and end the stalemate? I wish you well in doing it.
You know me, I'm the glass is always half full kind of guy. So I wish all of you could be up here with my vantage point. So when we all started out, George Mitchell, before he was ever a senator, was a genius young federal judge. Bertie and Tony and I, when we first got elected, most people didn't think we had enough sense as our age to be assuming the responsibilities we did. Now we're arguing which of our grandchildren will win a Nobel Prize in particle physics. Why do I say that? Because I'm sitting here and my view is Arlene and Mary Lou sitting in the same row. We just got to figure out how to get them to sit next to each other. And now wait a minute. Is there any other place in the world where the two leading parties are headed by young women, freely elected? So you got the old gray-haired guys can still talk on the stage about yesterday, but tomorrow is in their hands. And I have found it is always easy to pontificate about somebody else's problems. So I have no specific thing to say, because whatever my opinions are not possibly informed by what pressures are on them one way or the other. I just know this. It's a good thing that without bullet flying, these two parties, for all their differences, have been willing to invest their future in two women who have their own children and their own investment in your future first. Second thing I want to say is that the one thing I can say that age brings is too late sometimes, is an intimate familiarity with your own mortality. The country in this world with the largest number of women in government and a parliamentary majority of women is Rwanda. Why? Because they had a genocide and 10% of the country was killed in 90 days. And 85% of the people killed were men. It created a lot of promotion opportunities. You didn't have that, and yet there they are. Let them be a symbol of the future. One thing we have to do in life sooner or later is decide how we keep score. You can't control whether you win or lose all the time, but you at least ought to know as soon as possible how you're going to keep score. You heard what Bertie said. How does it affect the ordinary person? So I have one practical suggestion. Sooner or later, when you get around to putting a government back together, you still have to deal with the language, the legacy, the equality issues. Those are issues on which, if being together is important and ending paralysis is important, A 60% answer today may be much better than a 100% answer a year and a half from now. In the meanwhile, this Brexit thing can burn you badly if it's done wrong, or if special consideration is not taken of the economic decisions made under your leadership at the time. What was meant to make the Northern Ireland economy work should be preserved. So somehow or another, surely it'll be possible for the parties to have a common position on the economic interests which affects everybody without regard to their political party if they live in Northern Ireland. The rest of it you'll have to figure out. But I can tell you one thing. The one thing you don't have to figure out is biology, the passage of time. In the last month I was president, I went to the convention of one of the largest African American churches to speak and thank them for their consistent support. The president of the convention introduced me. I got up and I thought I was being so clever. I said, I'm so glad to be introduced by a president who's not term limited. And he went back to the microphone. He said, oh, Mr. President, we're all term limited. He said, some of us are just not smart enough to know it yet. So that is what I leave you with. These people gave you a gift. These people gave you a gift. People who lost loved ones and bore scars. The women's groups, the kids, everybody. They gave you a gift. Make the most of it. It's a precious gift. And in the process, remind the world that democracy is better than dictatorships, less subject to corruption, less subject to abuse, and more enduring. You can do all that. Remember, you inspired the world 20 years ago. You can do it all over again today because the rest of the world continues to do foolish things. You do smart things. Save the peace, save the freedom, save the democracy. Inspire the world. God bless you. Good luck.
Thank you. I'd like if before we conclude these proceedings, I'd like to mention two men who have been mentioned earlier today, but I want to say a special word about them. The independent chairman was in the plural, and while I served as the chairman, my two colleagues were Harry Holkeri, the former Prime Minister of Finland, and John de Chastelain, the former Chief of the Canadian General Staff. It is really incredible, but I say this in complete sincerity. We were together 2 years, and we never once had a disagreement over anything. Which restaurant we ate at that night, what the response to the various parties was. They were two of the finest colleagues I've ever served with anywhere. Prime Minister Holkeri passed away a few years ago. General de Chastelain still is in Canada. And I ask you please to join me in recognizing their great contribution to this process. I'm going to add to my list of lifetime achievements that moderating a program with 3 former heads of state, we only came in 13 minutes late. Vice Chancellor.
All I can say is, wow, what a wonderful afternoon. One for the history books. I'm sure you'll agree with me that we have just experienced something that is truly unique. Having the key players from the Good Friday Agreement period brought together to mark its 20th anniversary has been really something very special. Getting the perspectives and insights of our contributors this afternoon into how the agreement was reached was truly enlightening, allowing us to reflect on just how far we have progressed in Northern Ireland and indeed the considerable distance we still have to travel. I well remember standing in my kitchen in Belfast listening to the announcement that the Good Friday Agreement had indeed been agreed by the Northern Ireland voters. I was delighted. A new era for my young family to grow up in safety here in this great city. I have no words that can improve upon what we have already heard this afternoon, so all that remains for me is to once again thank all our speakers, our chairs, and our panelists for an afternoon that will remain long in our memory. Thank you also to Richard English and Hastings Donnan, and to the other members of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute, who, together with colleagues from across the university, have worked tirelessly to ensure this event was such a success. Thank you also to Yvette for keeping the programme flowing smoothly. And finally, let me thank you, the audience, for travelling to be with us today to share in such a significant and momentous occasion. Thank you very much indeed, and good evening.